This is Monocle on Fashion, a new show on Monocle Radio dedicated to the inner workings of the fashion industry. I'm Natalie Theodosi, Monocle's fashion director and your host. This episode is dedicated to Stephen Jones, a legend in the worlds of fashion and millinery. An exhibition dedicated to Stephen's work has just opened at the Palais Galliera in Paris. Titled Chapeaux d'Artiste, the exhibition doubles as a tale of two cities exploring Stephen's roots in London. He was one of the Blitz Kids and has plenty of stories to tell, as well as his work in Paris. Since the 1980s, thanks to a young Jean-Paul Gaultier's endorsement, Stephen found a second home in Paris. And since then, he has gone on to work for everyone, from Kim Jones at Dior, John Galliano at Maison Margiela, and Ray Kawakubo at Comme des Garçons. Given the opening of the exhibition, which will run until March 2025, so plenty of time to plan a trip to Paris and visit, the timing was ideal to sit down and speak to Stephen. When I asked him about working with the Palais Galliera on this show, I loved how he stressed that this is very much a work in progress, not a retrospective, which can often imply the end of a designer's career. Stephen is far from done. And this will become clear quite quickly when you start listening to our conversation. But exhibition aside, it's always a good idea to speak to Stephen Jones. A little personal story. Early on in my writing career, I used to have to cover fashion parties, which involves going up to famous designers, interrupting them while they're chatting and sipping champagne, and asking them for a quote for my story. It's as horrifying as it sounds, and a lot of the designers were understandably annoyed. But not Stephen Jones. He was always gracious and generous with his time, offering personal insights, rapid-fire lessons in fashion history, and words of encouragement. So thank you, Stephen, for being one of the fashion industry's few gentlemen. This time around, it was an even bigger treat to get proper uninterrupted time with the designer and quiz him about his life and early career. Let's hear directly from Stephen Jones.
I arrived at St. Martin's School of Art not really knowing anything about sewing at all. And it was my tailoring tutor who said to me I had to get some extra work experience. So I became an intern at his couture house. And next to it was a millinery workroom, and I transferred. And I had this bit of a eureka moment. I had no preconceived idea that I would be making hats or whatever. But I knew that fashion, as perceived by my tutors, was not what I wanted to do. I think they saw it as, how can I say, it was this very orthodox, middle-class, normcore in a way. And this was 1976. It was the first year of punk. So I thought that they were completely irrelevant. And they hated me too. The feeling was mutual, yeah. But with millinery, I found it was more expressive, that it was more, I don't know, it was just more exotic. And it was something that I could cope with. I didn't come from a dressmaking background. I didn't know anything about fabric, but I'd always loved making things, but solid objects. So a hat was something that I felt comfortable with, that was all.
How interesting. And like you say, that was such an exciting time. So you graduate from St. Martin's and very quickly you start your shop and you start making hats for everyone from Boy George to Grace Jones, right? So tell me a little bit about that time and life in the 80s, the club culture. What were you up to?
Well, I mean, I was definitely a club kid, and I was one of the Blitz Kids, as they talk about, and there's going to be the big exhibition next year at the Design Museum. And I was a few years older than many of the club kids at the time, and only like 3 years older or something. So I was really trying to make a business at the same time as going out and partying all night. But I had sort of one eye on Paris, but it wasn't the Paris contemporary Paris. I love this myth of Paris when I just had discovered in St. Martin's School of Art these books of old Vogues and Harper's Bazaar. And there were all these photographs by Henry Clark and Penn and Avedon and these models with like very arch attitudes. I thought that was wonderful. And it sort of reminded me of punk. But what was it like? It was mad. It's funny as well that economically, we never really talked about money. Money was a dirty word. If you were perceived as doing something for money, that would be the end of you because you're supposed to be doing it for the beauty of creativity, not for the money. So I came out of St. Martin's and Steve Strange, who ran the Blitz Club, who was the lead singer of Visage, fade great fame, which is still continuing, he had a day job too in a shop called PX in Covent Garden. They just moved to a new location. And he asked them if I could have the basement of their shop as a little hat shop. And on the 1st of October, 1980, less than a year of leaving college, I opened up my own little shop. And that was incredible. And that's how the shop happened. And it what really was a success from day one. We had everybody. We had Anna Piaggi came, Divine came, the wife of the governor of the Bank of England came. We had a few ladies of the street. They came, paid cash, bought the most expensive hats. Really, everybody. And that was the wonderful thing. It was quite democratic.
That's amazing. And I'm curious, how did people wear hats differently back then? And dress codes have changed drastically, and we're a little bit more casual these days. Have you noticed like a big shift? Were people more experimental at the time?
I don't know. Whether people are casual or more formal, the main thing was not how it ended up. We saw fashion as a way of expressing yourself and as a part of your sort of artistic creation.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't something you put on to look cool or fit in or whatever. It's, you could be painting or baking a cake or creating a fragrance or doing textiles, or you could be dressing yourself. That was the attitude. And hats sort of weren't part of the language of established fashion because really there was a vacuum which had been created by punk. And if you think of punk, yeah, Johnny Rotten did wear a beret occasionally, but it was about having spiky hair and bright pink. So hats were this weird anachronistic thing that seemed quite individual and unusual and quite decorative. So I think people definitely were wearing hats for dressing up. And people would say, well, this is my style of hat I'm going to wear, or this makes me look like that. It's all about the fantasy that they were putting on the hat, not the reality. But how is it people's attitude to hats different then to now? Well, completely different, of course.
It seems that at the time, like you said, if it was all about punk, hats seemed anachronistic, but you embraced both and kind of created a bridge between the two.
Well, exactly. And the funny thing was, because punk is absolutely nothing to do with a ripped pair of jeans and safety pins and black vinyl. And I thought that in a way, being a hat designer was probably the most punk thing that you could do because it was really anti-establishment. Because the establishment was about wearing beige knitwear or a hoodie and being comfortable, which was to me at that time an ultimate conformity. And if you wanted to be an individual, you sort of dressed up, I guess. There was no great theory to it. The main thing was we wanted to have a freedom. We wanted to have a freedom of expression. So we were just trying things out. It wasn't as though we had an agenda or it was a particular point of view. I think we didn't know what point of view we wanted to have, but we wanted to try anything.
And over the years, do you feel like you've been able to maintain this sense of freedom, this sense of experimentation as the industry becomes more mainstream, more commercialized, and there's a lot more at stake?
I think there were always a lot at stake, but the way that I've wanted to play my violin is I've wanted to keep some sort of individuality and some sort of creativity. That's what people come to me for. Maybe I was very lucky in finding my own little niche. But also at the same time, when I was making hats, I was making hats for real people. That's why my hats were always smaller, because I had to make hats you could dance in. It wasn't hats for a big fashion show. It wasn't a big crazy thing. It was for reality. So I was never really making hats my fantasy woman or fantasy man. They were just my friends. So in a way, that was what was commercial for me and still is today. When people come to me, what is commercial for me is something that, so they want Stephen Jones. They want something which is individual. They don't want a plain baseball cap. They don't want a beanie. They want something which has got creativity in it. And I think that's the way that fashion will go. It has to.
And we should talk about Paris, of course, as well. Like you said, you mentioned earlier, you've always kept an eye on Paris, and you were such a big part of London and British culture and punk. But tell me about, when did that relationship start with Paris, and when did you start traveling back and forth and working with the fashion houses there?
Well, I first started sort of knowing about Paris really probably when I was a teenager, and I'd met I was on holiday with my parents in Italy, and we met some French people, and I came to Paris to learn how to speak French. But I didn't particularly get on with their two sons, but the mother took me literally around every museum in Paris. Every day we would go to a different museum. So I had this sort of avalanche of French culture into my brain, age 15, 16, 17. So that was really the start of it. But after it being a couple of years, I was successful in the shop, but I didn't have very much of a media presence. Certainly, in new magazines like The Face, ID, Blitz magazine, who are really our magazines. Yes, I got press and publicity in that, but the established magazines like Vogue and Harper's and Tatler, etc., absolutely were not interested in me because they thought that I was too sort of alternative or ridiculous and didn't fit into their idea of what fashion was. But people said to me, well, your hats are more French, you'd be more of a success in Paris. So that had always been on the horizon. But really, my big break over there was through Jean-Paul Gaultier, because he
Mm-hmm.
used to come to the clubs in London. I'd met him. And in fact, I was in the Culture Club video of Do You Really Want to Hurt Me? And in that video, I'm wearing a three-piece suit and a fez, and that corresponded to the look he was going to do for his next men's collection. And he invited me to design women's hats for his collection. I mean, I had no idea. I wasn't going over there to sell hats, but he wanted part of me. And I continued to work with him for quite a few years. And in fact, even on the second time that I did a show with him, what was quite extraordinary was that always backstage, I have a big tray so I can move all the hats around. And at the end of the show, he picked up my tray and gave it to me and pushed me out onto the runway. And unbeknown to me, he'd asked all the girls on the runway to take their hats off and put them in the tray. And that's how Jean-Paul, introduced me to the world of Paris fashion.
And what an introduction. Wow.
I mean, I couldn't believe it, and I still can't. And that was the only time I had taken onto the runway until 3 years ago when Kim Jones took me out at the Dior Man show at the end of the show. And I did the runway with him because that was my 25 years as creative director of hats at Christian Dior.
Incredible. And it goes to show, club culture, going out, putting yourself out there, it does pay off, right? And just connecting with people.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. If you stay at home, not much is going to happen. And, funny enough, as Edith Piaf said, je ne regrette rien. I don't regret anything. But at the beginning, I was invited to lots of different things in the early 80s, and I didn't go because I was more concerned to make fabulous hats, and I had to stay behind at night and work and make hats. So sort of my clubbing days, I felt, was over, and getting on with creation of hats was important. And I think maybe life would have been a bit easier if
Mm-hmm.
how can you say I shouldn't have done one thing or the other? But I mean, I always say to everybody, you need to get your ass out there, because if you stay at home, it's not going to happen, especially now. Especially now. I mean, I think, of course, fashion is about communication. That's really what it is. And, white T-shirt is as much a communication as a big fancy hat. That's your point of view. And you can communicate electronically, and wonderful, it's around the world. But you also have to go and have that physical contact with people. That's how things happen.
Absolutely. And I mean, you're such a testament of that. And since meeting Gautier that time, you've been kept going back and forth to Paris and working with such an incredible roster of designers. And like you said, putting your work on the runway as well. How is that different working with a designer and thinking about a runway collection versus your customers in the shop in Covent Garden?
In a way, very much the same. Because, first of all, what you do is you talk to the person, you get to know them, you communicate, you start to understand a little bit their hopes and their dreams, what they're into, what their taste is, what they're doing, as much about them as you can. And then you build a hat on that. But it's that way round. You're not really thinking, I mean, of course, sometimes the customer will come in and they will say, I want a beret. Or I will talk to John Galliano and he'll say, I want a mask. But it really is this sort of conversation which I will then make into a hat. At the same time, when I am given a brief by a design, we've discussed it, and I've made these samples or done these sketches, and I take hats or the sketches out of the box, I'm always very sort of nervous because have I got it right? Have I got it wrong? Are they going to like it? Have I understood their point of view? Have they understood my point of view? And that's something you don't learn. And it does stay like the first time every season. And, 44 years down the line, it's still like that. It doesn't get any easier. There's always a next season.
It's not I think it's always a bit of an unfair question, but I have to ask you, have things been standing out? Any highlights when you look back at Paris and all the designers that you worked with, all the hats that you created with them?
I mean, absolutely. I think standout hats, you'd have to say Erin O'Connor in a gold Tutankhamun Nefertiti headdress, in an incredible gold outfit, in a Dior, John Galliano Dior Haute Couture show. That was a really extraordinary moment. My second season working with John as well was extraordinary. Meeting Reika Kubo at Anchorage Airport and making hats for her in 1984. As I said before, coming out on the runway with Gautier, receiving my OB from the Order of the British Empire from the Queen for services to millinery, the only one, as far as I know, the only one that's actually been described as that. And also, as well, I have to say, working with Daniel Risbury at Schiaparelli, Daniel, who I've known for a long time. He was design director of Thom Browne for 8 years, and I was almost a mentor for him, really. So for me to be at Schiaparelli is quite wonderful too.
I think it's worth talking about Dior as well, because you've had such a long relationship with the house and continue to work with all the creative directors. It was John Galliano in the past, now Maria Grazia Curie and Kim Jones. Tell me about your ties to the House of Dior over all these years.
Well, the main thing about Dior is Dior, of course. So whichever designer is there, there's this great overarching presence there of Monsieur Dior and then the designers who worked there since him. Monsieur Dior, Yves Saint Laurent, Marc Bourne, Gianfranco Ferre. It's, an extraordinary legacy. And also, of course, before Monsieur Dior was a dress designer, he did hat sketches. So that's how he started out. He was selling hat sketches to the great milliners of Paris in the 30s and 40s. So you're very aware of the history of Dior, and every designer who I work with there has interpreted it very differently. I mean, for example, Maria Grazia, in her attitude to hats, thinks that hats should just be a continuation of the look. That her brief to me is, I want every young fashionable girl in the world to be able to wear a Christian Dior hat. And in fact, Mr. Dior used to think about it in exactly the same way. He said famously, without hats, there is no civilization. But then for example, John Galliano wanted to tell a story with a hat. Raf adored a veil. And in fact, in his final portfolio for college, for his last year at college, he did this huge study on veils, bizarrely enough. So I have a different relationship with all of them, but I think it's the legacy of Monsieur Dior personally, who's always propelled it, and also Dior is the only haute couture house which has its own atelier mode, its own hat workroom, and it's great that I have. In my hat workroom, I've got one or two blocks from Monsieur Dior. I've got flowers there from Gianfranco Ferre. I've got even we have some ribbons from the time of Yves Saint Laurent when he was there in the late 50s, early 60s. So it's great to have that history, but also how to use that history as inspiration and make something which is very contemporary.
It's so interesting that you say the most important thing about Dior is Dior and how you adapt to different creative directors' briefs. A lot of the conversations I've been having with different designers on this show is a little bit about that and about how it is important to think about heritage, to think about the brand as a whole, rather than this idea that a creative director needs to kind of impose their own personal vision over everything. And people have also spoken about the importance of setting ego aside a little bit in fashion and in our world. What do you think about all that?
Well, what's the point of being designer in a house if you're interested in the house in the first place? I mean, from my personal experience, I mean, I know that John had always been inspired by Monsieur Dior, which is why he really wanted to go there, which is why Monsieur Arnaud took him on. I know that Raf, when he was working at Jill Sander, was hugely inspired by Monsieur Dior and this idea of mid-century elegance, this sort of myth of La Parisienne. And I know from Maria Grazia, Maria Grazia was even approached by Dior many, many years beforehand and offered her a job. I mean, it was that there were very specific reasons why these designers came there. But I think, it's also the management. Dior is very unique in that respect, that it has always been successful and really what the different owners have always wanted to be reminded of Monsieur Dior, whereas at other houses, sometimes they don't want to be reminded of the original designer, that they're not so proud of their legacy and they're trying to chase something else because the grass is always greener on the other side. I think, you need to celebrate the individuality of what you do, and fashion will come to you. You don't have to go to fashion. I think that's one of the most important things that I've learned as well.
Let's talk about the Palais Galliera exhibition as well.
Sure.
A lot of designers have mixed feelings about the idea of a retrospective. How did you want to approach it to make it your own and kind of tell your story in the museum?
Well, I find it hilarious that people have described it recently as being in retrospective. I never considered it like that because it's very much work in progress.
Yeah.
And I know a few designers have said to me, oh my God, I never want to have a retrospective because that's what happens when you're dead. But I think I'm actually feeling quite alive today, bizarrely enough. But for me, I mean, number one, it's a huge honor. I never, ever imagined in 1,000 years that I would have an exhibition at maybe the most important fashion museum in the world. I mean, how extraordinary for that to happen to anybody, not only me. And it's an incredible honor, but it's a real pleasure as well to be able to share with people what I have done and what hats can be and how entertaining and wonderful hat can be. And in the world of accessories, it's a little bit the runt of the litter. Handbags come first and then shoes and then maybe scarves. And then there's hats sort of up a little tributary of their own. But hats also have more charm. People connect with hats visually more than any other accessory. And that I'm quite sure of. But the Palais Galliera curated the exhibition on me. I didn't curate it myself. I sort of helped them and advised them, but it's their story on me. And what I loved when they went away and they presented me with different ideas was, Stephen, that they said, your uniqueness is that you have one foot in Paris and one foot in London. And that's what we'd like to explore. And it was the most simple and most obvious idea, and one which I had not thought of. I thought that was great and simple and charming.
That's so interesting. And do you find that that has also informed the way that you approach design, that tale of the two cities?
I think it has done because for me, because I'm 67 years old, when I was growing up, the mystique of a hat was always a Parisian hat. It was never a British hat. However, I do concede that around the world now everybody thinks that hats are British, which is largely because of the late Majesty Queen II and various social reasons and horse racing and ceremonies and things like that. People think hats are British. But for me, I love the idea of the Parisian in a hat and that myth of glamour, je ne sais quoi, which I put in my hats and then I make it lighter with hopefully British wit and lightness. Ah. But
Yeah.
I don't always achieve it. That's what I hope to do.
You do, and I think it's such a valid point what you said that people it's an opportunity for people to start maybe thinking a little bit more about hats, the humor and the charm of it all. And earlier in our conversation, you did say that our relationship with millinery, the way we wear hats, is very different. But do you see a bright future for the craft and also for younger designers who might be wanting to follow in your footsteps?
It was quite interesting. In fact, last night I visited a hat studio. And this is a, sort of a studio, it's almost like a cooperative of young hat designers in Paris. And they were so excited about the Palais Galliera and said, oh God, you do such amazing work. But it's so good for us in France. So because it puts hats back on the agenda. And I said, but hats are always on the agenda. They said, well, people don't wear hats in the way they used to. I said, well, in a funny way, they do. Because if you look at an old Vogue or an old Harper's or whatever, you see these ladies in a big hat with a veil on and flowers and things. But in real life, they weren't necessarily wearing hats like that. They were wearing a little beret, a little felt hat, something like that, because they were rushing around town, taking the children to school, traveling, blah, blah, blah. In just the same way that now, you have a bonnet, like a little knitted beanie. People will wear a baseball cap. So hats are alive because they correspond to the correct moment and what you're wearing it for. So it doesn't look like costume. But what's great is I think now this idea that you can put a hat on and you can dress up in a certain way is really on the agenda again. I mean, look at Beyonce last year in her tour. She was wearing a hat in almost every show. Rihanna is an incredible customer of ours. Lady Gaga, in her new video, she's wearing one of my hats, and I made her a hat for the opening of the Olympics and used it for the closing of the Olympics. So I think hats have got a really strong future. And also, I think that hats, when I was growing up, was very much an expensive department store purchase. But now it's more of a craft object that everybody can make something at home. And there's lots of milliners in every city all over Europe who are making things for their local communities and maybe doing a hat class at evening school or something. They're not making hats for Yves Saint Laurent runway show, but they're making hats for fun.
That's a great and the kind of optimism that we want, and I know you're spreading the message even further. So you've got the exhibition at the Palais Galliera, and you're also going to Riyadh as well in Saudi Arabia. Uh,
Yeah.
how did that come about? And it's so interesting that you're in Paris, one of the biggest, most established fashion capitals in the world, but
Mhm.
also going into a very fast changing emerging market in a way.
Yeah. So I'm going there because the exhibition, Dior Designer of Dreams, which started off at the Musée des Arts Décoratifs in Paris about 8 years ago, is traveling to Saudi Arabia. And it's going to be at the National Museum there. And this is the story of Monsieur Dior, how he started, and of course, the legacy of all the different designers who have come after him. And it's a very big exhibition. There's certain special sections which are to do with the Middle East. And I mean, to show how the world has changed politically, if you look at Monsieur Dior's dresses from the 50s, they were often called soirée, which means evening. And there'd be soirée à Istanbul, soirée à Baghdad, and all these different places in the Middle East. That really inspired him because he really appreciated Islamic culture, often used their motifs and things like that, and decorative elements as embroidery motifs in his dresses. So he was incredibly inventive and creative in that respect. And no, it's going to be quite an adventure showing it to a Saudi Arabian client.
And it goes to show how millinery and fashion at large is such a powerful soft power tool for cultural conversations and exchange, right?
Yes, because I think, money and politics can't solve the problems of the world, but maybe art and culture can.
That was Stephen Jones. And that's all for today's show. Make sure you subscribe and stay tuned. We have more big interviews and exclusive insights into the world of fashion planned for the rest of the year. Our first season is brought to you by our friends at My Theresa Men, the global retailer offering the finest edit in luxury. Today's episode was produced and edited by Lily Austin. I'm Natalie Theodosi. Thank you for listening.